So I'm Jamie Goodrich, the director of the Humanities Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Joshua Wilburn to give a talk today. Josh Wilburn is an associate professor and also the chair of the philosophy department. And he serves on the advisory board for the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program, but also for the Humanities Center, which is not in your bio, Josh.
You're right.
He received his BA from the University of Texas at Austin and his PhD from Princeton University. And his main research areas are ancient Greek philosophy and the history and philosophy of race and racism. He is the author of The Political Soul, Plato on Thumos, Spirited Motivation, and The City, which was published by Oxford in 2021. And he has a forthcoming article in the feminist philosophy journal Hypatia on Plato's critique of masculinity. His current work focuses on early Greek foundations of modern conceptions of race, as well as on the history of Black American perspectives on the moral psychology and epistemology of racism. And I would be remiss if I didn't again say that he is a very important member of our advisory board and a great friend of the center. And I'm really glad to have him there, and his input is invaluable. Today, he'll be speaking to us on the topic, Nice White People and the Epistemology of Ignorance in Langston Hughes.
So I'm trying to get the buttons ready. So thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming today. This has been a kind of labor of love that I've been working on for the past couple of years. And what I'm going to do today is a little bit of philosophy, a little bit of history, a little bit of literary analysis. But mostly I kind of want to just read some Langston Hughes to you and talk about some interesting passages and texts. So just a few words about who Langston Hughes was. So he was born in 1902. He died in 1967. He was one of the leading figures of the Harlem Renaissance. He's best known for his poetry, but he wrote prolifically in nearly every imaginable literary genre, including plays, novels, essays, translations, history, children's books, autobiography, newspaper columns, and also a great deal of short stories and short fiction, which is a lot of what I'll be focusing on today. So let me say a few things about what I mean when I speak of nice white people, as in the title. So this is a pre-theoretical concept. So I'm not going to be offering something like a philosophical definition here, but I'm going to list a few things that tend to be true of nice white people as they're presented in Hughes and other Black writers. So nice is often synonymous with good or liberal or progressive. It's often white people who are, so to speak, on the right side of history. So nice white people of this sort have existed in every age of American history. So in the 1800s, this might have been abolitionists. In Hughes' lifetime, it would have been supporters of the civil rights movement. In our current time, it might be something like Democrats or anti-Trump voters or something like that. Part of white nice people often is that it's often an important part of their or our identity to think of ourselves as nice and good in this way, by contrast to those who are on the wrong side of history, slave owners, segregationists, Trump supporters, whatever that is for the person in question. However, despite this self-conception, we are often ourselves racist or engage in racist or harmful behavior. So examples of portrayals of nice white people, again, sort of exist throughout the history of Black literature. If we fast forward, if we rewind to about 100 years before Hughes' lifetime, in Frederick Douglass's 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, he writes, "The abolitionists themselves were not entirely free from prejudice." He's referring to when he started traveling in abolitionist circles in New England. "And I could see that they were nobly struggling against it. In their eagerness sometimes to show their contempt for the feeling, they proved that they had not entirely recovered from it, often illustrating the saying in their conduct that a man may stand up so straight as to lean backward." Brilliant metaphor. "When it was said to me, 'Mr. Douglass, I will walk to meeting with you. I am not afraid of a Black man,' I could not help thinking, seeing nothing very frightful in my appearance, and why should you be?" If we fast forward about 100 years after Hughes' lifetime, We find an example of such discussion in the 2018 memoir of Austin Channing Brown, I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. In that, she has a chapter titled Nice White People. And she writes, for example, in my experience, white people who believe they are safe often prove dangerous when that identity is challenged. This is in part because most white people still believe they're good and the true racists are easy to spot. This is why the word racist offends nice white people so deeply. It challenges their self-identification as good people. Sadly, most white people are more worried about being called racist than about whether their actions are in fact racist or harmful. And there's a lot of other examples throughout history. So Ida B. Wells and Audre Lorde both talk about their encounters with leftist white feminists in their respective ages. Two of the best-selling novels of Hughes' lifetime by Black authors, Richard Wright's Native Son and Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, both prominently deal with problems related to progressive white people. It's in the work of people like James Baldwin, MLK. It's really sort of a very common theme. But today I'm going to focus on Langston Hughes. This is Hughes pictured with his one of his longtime friends, Carl Van Vechten. So on the one hand, in Hughes' work, he often and repeatedly throughout his career goes out of his way to emphasize that not all white people are bad, that some or even many are good or decent or nice. And in drawing this distinction, he certainly had his share of experiences with bad white people, so to speak. So throughout his life, he was hounded by segregationists, racists, religious conservatives, far-right activists. One of the especially difficult parts of his life was in the early 1940s when he was dogged by accusations of communism and atheism, and his ability to even make a living more or less ground to a halt because everywhere he went, he was hounded by protesters. So this is the front cover, or the front page of the Detroit Free Press from April 15th, 1943. And if you zoom in here, there's a story about protests here at Wayne State University, then called Wayne University. He appeared as a speaker here, and the usual protesters showed up. Luckily, in this case, it turned out for the best. The university president at the time issued a public statement on the value of free speech. The talk went forward, and at the end of it, he was met with a standing ovation. So to return to our sort of rough and ready distinction between good or nice white people and bad white people, it's the difference between the one standing in the auditorium cheering for him and the one standing outside with picket signs. Now, despite that emphasis, Hughes often, again, repeatedly throughout his career, expressed his disappointment, frustration, and anger with liberal white folks throughout his life. And he explores the various ways that good white people exhibit racism and contribute to the racist systems they purport to disavow. And based on his presentation of nice white people throughout his career, we can construct something like an account of several characteristic features of white niceness as he understands it, as well as how they're linked to an epistemology of ignorance. The title of my talk turns out to be a bit of false advertising. I'm really not going to talk about the epistemology of ignorance today because I just don't have time and it's too big. But just to sort of gesture at where this is going and how it will connect, the phrase epistemology of ignorance is credited to Charles Mills in his 1997 book, The Racial Contract. It's been one of the most influential philosophical concepts of the last quarter century. And the idea behind it is that the social and historical conditions under which we form our beliefs tend to foster and reward mistaken beliefs about the nature of race and racism in society and in ourselves. And we as white people in particular are socialized not only to be ignorant, but to feel extraordinary confidence about the rightness of our ignorant beliefs about race and racism. So to connect this to the talk, this epistemology of ignorance is evident from Hughes' perspective, not only in openly racist white people, but also in nice white people. So again, today I'll just focus on the account, but that's where that's where it's going. I had a really important section on caveats and clarifications. I'm just going to skip it. It was too long. So maybe those can come out in the Q&A. So now the rest of the talk, I'm basically just going to kind of like go through sort of excerpt by excerpt at Hughes and sort of pull out some of the features that typify his characterization of liberal white people. The first story that I'm going to focus on is from his 1933 collection of short stories, The Ways of White Folks. And it is exactly what it sounds like. It's a collection of short stories that deal with white people, their behavior, and in particular, their behavior in their relationships with Black people. And the story that I'll focus on first is a story called Poor Little Black Fellow. The story illustrates what Hughes elsewhere calls, quote, the lovely grinning face of white philanthropy. It focuses on a white Christian couple in New England, the Pembertons. And when two of their married servants pass away, they decide to raise their child Arnie as their own. Hughes, in his portrayal, emphasizes the kindness with which the Pembertons and their town treat Arnie throughout his youth. So he writes, the church and the Pembertons were really a little proud of Arnie. Did they not all accept him as their own? And did they not go out of their way to be nice to him, a poor little Black fellow whom they, through Christ, had taken in? Throughout the years, the whole of Mapleton began to preen itself on its charity and kindness to Arnie. One would think that nobody in the town need ever again do a good deed, that this acceptance of a Black boy was quite enough. Their kindness has its limits, though, which become more pronounced as Arnie grows up into a young man. So he's excluded from the Boy Scouts, he has trouble making friends in this white town, and nobody will date him or allow their daughter to date him. So naturally, as he gets older, he feels increasingly sort of alienated and lonely in this town. In response, his parents and the town as a whole become worried about him, and they decide to, quote, be extra nice to him. The climax of the story takes place the summer following his high school graduation, when the Pembertons take him on a trip to Paris. There, Arnie meets a Black singer staying in their hotel, who takes him out with her friends into the Paris nightlife, where for the first time in his life, he finds that he isn't conscious of color. The Pembertons, however, become concerned about his behavior. They lecture him for being unappreciative of what they've done for him. Ultimately, they decide they will try to reform him by showing him even more love. Hughes writes, so once again, the Pembertons turned loose on Arnie their niceness. The final straw comes when Arnie tells them he doesn't want to return to America and to the segregated life he lives there. The Pembertons become enraged at his ungratefulness and kick him out of the hotel and out of their lives forever, calling him a Black devil. Hughes also writes that Arnie can feel the N-word burning in the back of their throats to spit out at him in that moment, although they don't actually say it. Now, the story reflects important experiences from Hughes' own life. And I'm not speculating here. He's very explicit about this in his writing about this collection. So in 1927, so he would have been in his mid-20s, and this would have been just a few years before the stories were published. Hughes met a woman named Charlotte Osgood Mason, who was a wealthy heiress and philanthropist, who began giving him a stipend to support his writing. He had a very, very deeply close relationship to her. He writes about her like she was a mother he never had, in a way. She was an amazing, brilliant, and powerful personality. I was fascinated by her, and I loved her. No one else had ever been so thoughtful of me or so interested in the things I wanted to do or so kind and generous toward me. This is from his autobiography, written in 1940. However, despite her kindness, she was an incredibly controlling patron. So she insisted that he call her godmother, demanded that he write her letters daily, often had demands about who he should not write letters to. She required fastidious accounts of every penny he spent, where he was, what he was doing. And worst of all for Hughes, she tried to control his writing itself. And she tried to control it in accordance with a particular view she held about Black artists. She thought that they were, as Hughes puts it, a link to a pure mystical primitive that was uncontaminated by the Western world. And she wanted Hughes' writing to reflect that. The patronage and the relationship abruptly ended in 1930 when Hughes' inability to live up to her expectations resulted in a final break and a really sort of brutal rejection by her of him. He was emotionally devastated by that. It was one of the lowest emotional points in his whole life. He rarely writes about his inner emotional states, but this episode comes out in his autobiography, and it's one of the few that does. Shortly after their break, he wrote her, we have a series of desperate letters that he wrote her. Here's just one sort of excerpt. He says, "As long as I worked on my novel, dear godmother, I think we were one. But when you told me that I should have begun my writing again the week after I returned from Cuba, I must disagree with you. I must never write when I do not want to write. That's my last freedom, and I must keep it for myself. And when you tell me that you give me more than anybody else ever gave me before, and that I've been living in idleness since the 1st of March, I feel miserably ashamed." So he felt really like shame, rejection, and just sort of, he was emotionally distraught during this period. Later, again, in his autobiography, he comments on the reasons for this break, or among the reasons. "She wanted to be more African than Harlem, primitive in the simple, intuitive, and noble sense of the word. I couldn't be, having grown up in Kansas City, Chicago, and Cleveland." Okay, so the Pembertons and godmother illustrate some characteristic features of white niceness as Hughes understands it. So first of all, their niceness is imperious, it's officious, and it's patronizing. So it's niceness on terms determined by white people, the white people in question, and it's guided by their confident, and it turns out confidently wrong, white ideas about what is good for the Black individuals they're purporting to help. In that respect, it assumes and reinscribes a white supremacist power structure. It makes assumptions about who has power and who doesn't, who needs to be guided and saved, and who does the guiding and saving, who makes the decisions and who obeys. Another sort of key characteristic feature of white niceness that comes out in this text is that it's conditional. It's conditional, first of all, on the Black person in question being the kind of Black person the white friend wants them to be. So notice that for the Pembertons and godmother, these go in different directions. The Pembertons essentially want Arnie to be as much like a respectable middle-class New England white person as he can be, given that he is Black. Whereas godmother wants Hughes to be this kind of idealized caricature that she has in her head of what a Black artist should be. In neither case can they happily live up to those standards or those expectations. And as soon as they fail, the love is withdrawn, the kindness is withdrawn. It's also conditional, this is sort of a twin point, on the Black friends or the Black person's reflecting back to the white person the image of themselves that they want to see. Both the Pembertons and godmother demand uncritical admiration, uncritical gratitude. And again, when those fail to be perceived as being sufficient, the gratitude, the admiration, the love is withdrawn. And it's not just that the love is withdrawn, but both in the case of the Pembertons and godmother, it's replaced by rage and indignation. Okay. So the next story I'm going to talk about, let me set this up by giving some context. It's one of Langston Hughes' simple stories. I think maybe all of what I'm going to be reading from here on out is one of the simple stories. So from 1943 until 1965, Hughes was a weekly columnist for the Chicago Defender, one of the nation's leading Black newspapers. And he used that column for different purposes. Sometimes he just writes straightforward columns, sometimes it was the travel logs. But he also wrote these sort of recurring episodic short fictional pieces that featured this same character, Jesse B. Semple. And the format of these is always a conversation between Semple and a friend of his in a bar. Hughes describes Jesse Semple as an ordinary Black man living in Harlem. And he's very loquacious and very opinionated. And the stories are always narrated from the point of view of the bar friend, but he's mostly just telling the reader what Semple is saying because Semple is the talkative, opinionated one. Okay, so, oh yeah, and one other thing. They're comedic and satirical in nature, but they often also address really serious and pressing sort of political issues, international issues, or racial issues. So Simple says, now the way I understand it, it's been written down a long time ago that all men are born equal and everybody is entitled to life and liberty while pursuing happiness. It's in the Constitution, also Declaration of Independence, so I do not see why it has to be resolved all over again. Who is resolving it? I asked. Some white church convention. I read in the papers where they resolved all that and the golden rule too. Also that Black folks should be treated right. It looks to me like white folks better stop resolving and get to doing. Resolving ain't solving. They've been resolving for 200 years. I don't see why they need to resolve anymore. I say they need to solve. So what this illustrates is that white niceness is often effusive and ostentatious in expressing verbal support for racial justice, while refraining from any concrete actions or difficult work actually involved in bringing about that racial justice. Again, I think an episode from Hughes' biography is revealing. When he was a sophomore at Lincoln University, this would have been around 1927, he attended his first interracial conference hosted by Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The conference was focused on issues related to Black unemployment, segregation, and other race issues. Hughes comments, on the last day of the conference, while they were drawing up resolutions, it seemed to me that there might as well be one really practical resolution regarding Black folks somewhere on the list. I have always been an opponent of the general and the vague. So Hughes thought it was strange that despite there being a large Black local population in the town, Franklin and Marshall College itself refused to admit any Black students. And he suggested a concrete practical resolution to address the problem of segregation on that very campus where they had convened to talk about race issues. So he proposed it, but he continues, but I could get no action on such a resolution at all. Everybody shied away. And the white director of our conference said regarding this problem in his final talk to the assembled delegates, there are some things in this world we must leave to Jesus, friends. Let us pray. So they prayed, and the conference ended. I think that Hughes takes this coupling of, on the one hand, vocal displays of support for racial justice, with, on the other hand, the craven refusal to actually do anything about it, to be one of the defining features of white niceness and white liberalness. And I think that's illustrated nicely by another Simple story. Here's Hughes pictured with author Gwendolyn Brooks. So here, Simple asks his friend, just what is a liberal? Well, as nearly as I can tell, a liberal is a nice man who acts decently toward people, talks democratically, and often is democratic in his personal life, but doesn't stand up very well in action when some real social issue like Jim Crow comes up. Like my boss, said Simple, who is always telling me he believes in equal rights and I'm the most intelligent Black man he ever saw, and I deserve a better job. I say, why don't you give it to me then? He says, unfortunately, I don't have one for you. But ever so often you hire new white men that ain't had the experience of me, and I have to tell them what to do, though they are over me. How come that? Well, he says, the time just ain't right. Is that what a liberal is? Asked Simple. So the story goes on, and Simple asks if liberals have a mascot. And by that, he has in mind that Republicans have an elephant and Democrats have a donkey. So, liberals should have a mascot too. He proposes that it should be an ostrich. His friend is bewildered, so he explains, ain't you never seen an ostrich? Old ostrich sticks his head in the sand whenever he doesn't want to look at anything, but he leaves his hind parts bare for anybody to kick him square in the caboose. An ostrich is just like nice white folks who can smile at me so sweet as long as I'm working and sweating and don't ask for nothing. As soon as I want a promotion or raising pay, down go their heads in the sand, and they cannot see their way clear. The timing right. So again, here we see the pairing of vocality on the one hand and inactivity on the other. And this is unfortunately a timeless criticism of white progressives. Today it's evident, just to give one example, in the critical concept of performative allyship. That's essentially sort of illustrating the same kind of criticism that Hughes is evoking here. Another detail in the story I just read that I want to highlight, is the idea that many liberals are, quote, democratic in their personal lives. This feature of white niceness is exhibited or evident in another story titled Apple Strudel. Simple says, the white folks down where I work is always discussing this race problem. I tell them that white folks can measure their race problem by how far they've come, but Black folks measure ours by how far we've got to go. Then white folks are always telling me, isn't it wonderful the progress that's been made amongst your people? And then there follows a back and forth between Simple and the white friends, where they keep sort of naming one, like sort of what they take to be a sign of progress. And Simple comes back and says, explains why that doesn't affect him or anybody he's ever met who's Black. So finally, the white friends give up and say, you are most pessimistic about things. You would be too if you was Black, I say. And now this is Simple just talking to his bar friend. They mean well, them white folks I work with, but they just don't know. One white fellow last week says, here, I was telling my wife about you and she baked some apple strudel and sent you one for a present for you and your girl. I said, thank you, because I knew he meant well. He would also like to do well. Still and yet, he is one of the very ones who will argue with me most about how the race problem is improving, beat me down that things is getting so much better, how we got so many white friends in America. Just because he gives me an apple strudel, does he think I can give everybody in Harlem a slice? So here, I think what we see, and it's evidenced in a lot of other Hughes, other fiction, is the idea that there's a sort of warped perception of social and racial progress among nice white people. What Hughes, or what Simple's white friends are displaying is a sort of insistent need to believe in progress. And on the other side, this obtuseness about the reality, the depth, and the ubiquity of the problem of racial injustice. So, you know, he keeps explaining to them why something doesn't count as progress, and Simple's realism about things, his experiences of racism as a Black man, are ultimately dismissed as pessimism. Notice that the white friends the white friend is also, sorry, the white friend is illustrating the sort of an individualistic, a focus on individualistic niceness as a substitute for racial progress. So the friend, from the friend's perspective, he thinks of himself, we can imagine, as a nice white person, the sort of white person whose girlfriend bakes a pie for his Black colleague. And yet, he refuses to see the real problems of racism that Simple is facing. So he takes this sort of like in his, you know, he's being democratic in his personal life on an individualistic basis. There's a sort of token of generosity or kindness, and that sort of substitutes for racial progress. Hughes criticizes this tendency in other essays, or in other work. So this is an essay now in Hughes' own voice titled Random Thoughts on Nice People. He says, another trouble with nice people is that they think all you have to do to be nice is to act that way. They're mistaken. Liberals who genteelly want to reform the world are nice people, but they don't know that Chicago gangsters are really nicer because they are more realistic. The Nazis are really nicer because they don't hide the bad cards in their deck. They mark them plainly marked. They don't underpay with a kiss or segregate with sanctimony. The warped perception of social progress that we see here is also highlighted in another Simple story that was written just after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which Simple is characteristically skeptical about. He says, I don't see nothing to be proud of, just doing what they ought to do. If white folks was doing something extra, yes, then be proud. Then white folks downtown where I work are just as proud of themselves as they can be, talking about, there now, you see what democracy can do? We're not so bad in this country after all. Well, I says, it took a whole lot of arguing to persuade them judges to make up their minds to do right. That lawyer named Marshall Nearbout spoke himself hoarse in the last 10 years. I see nothing to be so proud about when it is so hard and so expensive for white folks to do right. And once you start doing right, the more you blow your own horn, the less good what you are doing sounds to me. And Simple continues, that's just it. White folks have been determined to keep me down for so long that now that they're turning me loose, it's just like when you've had your foot on a man's head. You finally take your foot off and say, ain't I wonderful? I took my foot off your head. I'll be dogged if I see anything wonderful about that. So again, we see the warped perception of social progress. And we also see another feature of white niceness, which is the tendency to be self-congratulatory. We as white people love to congratulate ourselves and one another on anything that we ourselves perceive as progress, even if it is in fact, as Simple perceives it, more like inching our way toward the bare minimum of human decency. Notice that the self-congratulatory aspect of white niceness was also evident in the story about the Pembertons. They in the town, preened themselves on their goodness in taking care of Army. Okay, and I'll conclude with two passages. So Simple says, since I saw them pictures a while back on the front page of the New York Times of that police dog in Birmingham biting a young black student in the stomach, I have ceased to like white folks, said Simple. As bad as Birmingham is, I said, surely you do not blame white people in New York or Detroit or San Francisco for that Alabama dog. I do, said Simple, because white folks is in the majority everywhere. They control the government in Washington, and if they let such things go on in this American country, such has been going on in Alabama and Mississippi, I blame them all. And another story closely connected to this one thematically is titled Coffee Break. So in this story, Simple's boss asks him, what is it that Black people want? And Simple is immediately annoyed that he's being asked to speak as a spokesperson for all Black people. So his boss changes his approach and says, then what do you want? To get out of jail, I said. What jail? The jail you got me in. Me, yells my boss. I have not got you in jail. Why, boy, I like you. I am a liberal. I voted for Kennedy, and this time for Johnson. I believe in integration. Now that you got it, though, what more do you want? So what we see here is a characteristic denial of any accountability for racism and racist structures by nice white people. The boss is exhibiting a characteristic refusal to countenance even the possibility of complicity in the problem of racism. Note the indignation with which the boss responds. He yells at him. Note also that he calls him boy, a demeaning, racialized or racist term. For us as white people, racism tends to have this kind of elusive over there-ness. It's always a problem with other white people in another part of the country. And fixing the problem of racial injustice is always, those people's problem, rather than anything that we could have anything to do with. And the boss is illustrating that despite in Simple's mind being very much not off the hook, so to speak, for accountability. And I think that this denial of accountability is in a way the flip side of the individualistic focus on niceness. Again, the idea is I baked an apple strudel for you. I'm off the hook racially. So any implication that I might be on the hook racially for social injustices is going to be met with rage and indignation. Okay, so I'll end there. Those are all the main passages I kind of wanted to get out. I just highlighted a few things. There's a lot more to unpack in any one of these than I had time to do, but this sort of like gestured at some of the main points. So yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you for that talk. I think I'm going to slide over and see if I can try to juggle both conversations in the room and online.
Yeah, sure.
So we'll open up the conversation for, we'll open up for discussion now. Who'd like to start?
So this is just an invitation. If you, so you, well, you had said you didn't get to everything he wanted to. In particular, some of the ties back to Mill's work, and sort of
Some of the what?
ties back to Mill's work.
Yeah.
And epistemology of ignorance. Would you be willing to say a little bit about that? Because I'd be interested in hearing some how this connects.
That part is less developed. I mean,
Okay.
like,
Yeah.
me getting this out for this presentation was like sort of my first attempt at starting this. But I think like, so you can see in several of the episodes that although Hughes is, Simple is very much sort of like a folk heroic kind of character. He's not a theoretician or a philosopher, but you see a lot of references to sort of epistemological issues. So you see, for example, Hughes, when his white friend accuses him of pessimism, he says, you'd be pessimistic too if you was Black. There's very much throughout Hughes' work, and of course, this is not, this is a common theme in Black literature and Black philosophy in general, is an emphasis on lived personal experience as a source of knowledge. And I think that Simple very much throughout the Simple stories focuses on that. The idea that, so although Simple himself isn't developing this idea, Hughes elsewhere develops it a little bit more, not in a way that perfectly anticipates Mill's, but the idea is, just as Black lived experience is a source of knowledge about racial injustice, similarly, the flip side of that is that white lived experience is a source of their ignorance about those same issues. So that's like one example of how this would kind of connect forward to Mill's.
Yeah, and here's just a quick follow-up. There was in one of the Simple stories, Simple was saying, he used like several counterfactual phrases, like if they knew.
Yeah.
Or but he didn't specify what it was that they did or didn't know. Do you have a sense of sort of like how Hughes, if he was fleshing out like those knowledge claims or lack of knowledge claims?
So like, are you referring to, there's one where it says those white folks mean well, but they just don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, what he has in mind, just very generally speaking, is that they don't have the lived experiences that somebody like Simple has living in Harlem. So all of the things that they perceive as progress, Simple or Hughes know, because Hughes lived in Harlem as well. They both know, living there among Black people and being Black themselves, that those supposed tokens of racial progress or a shift toward racial justice don't actually affect anyone and their lived experiences in the positive ways that the lived Hughes. I think that's generally speaking what it's about.
Thanks.
So this was great, thank you. So I had just kind of a general question. I've sometimes had conversations with people where we talk about things like this, and we always want to be very careful not to like essentialize any group of people. And I can hear some people in my life that I don't agree with saying, well, aren't we just essentializing white people by setting up these features? And I don't agree with this, but I just wondered how you would respond to an objection like that.
I think there's a couple ways one might respond. To talk about Hughes' response, again, Hughes himself wants to, Hughes makes a lot of nuanced, his presentation of white people is very complex and nuanced, and even nice white people. So first of all, he often emphasizes, as I said, that lots of nice people are good, decent, nice white folks. Even within the categorization of liberal white folks or nice white folks and his criticism of them, even within that, he still very much thinks that not all white people exhibit all of these traits. So the collection of short stories, The Ways of White Folk, was dedicated to one of his best lifelong friends, Noel Sullivan, who was a white man in California, who invited Hughes to sort of live on his estate while he wrote the novel. So Hughes himself is very nuanced when it comes to dealing with white people, and sometimes a character in his story will essentialize. But what we also see in Hughes, and you saw some of it in the view of the unnamed bar friend, or usually unnamed bar friend, the bar friend says things like, surely you don't mean all white people. And sometimes Hughes responds humorously. So there's an episode where Hughes talks about, they're talking about religion. He says, you know, I hope the next time Jesus comes back, he smites all white people down. And his friend says, surely you don't mean all white people. And Simple responds, no, I hope he leaves Mrs. Roosevelt alone. So he always sort of like makes room, whether it's satirically or humorously, for there being exceptions. So he's really making, first of all, he's portraying, if you put all of his portrayals of white people and nice white people together, you have a really rich diversity of characterizations of white people that I think answers to the complexity of human life in a really nice way. So I don't think that objection is a great objection to Hughes. Hughes does think that a lot of white people exhibit these qualities. And he also, you know, but I mean, another thing to say is that he also thinks a lot of Black liberals exhibit some of them as well. And so that complicates his view a little bit. And what he has to say about liberal Black folks is, you know, an interesting topic in itself. He suffered or experienced a lot of like snobbery from Black elites, especially in Washington, D.C. in his lifetime, that really like affected him deeply. So anyway, he doesn't think only white people exhibit these qualities, and he doesn't think all white people exhibit some of these qualities. But he does say in his work that he thinks, you know, more liberal white people illustrate them than liberal Black people. So he does think that that's true. He also says, you know, elsewhere he says that he thinks that circumstances, and this is something that makes him sympathetic to white people. He says that he pities them because he thinks that the way that our society is makes it really, really hard for white people to actually be nice and decent and not to be ignorant in the ways that we are. So yeah, I think his view is very nuanced. I mean, if you're, a different question is like how to respond to a white person in the year 2023,
Right.
who's sensitive to the
Exactly.
prospect that they are being implicated
Exactly.
in any kind of negative racial injustice issues. I don't have a good answer to how to get around that.
Yeah. That's okay.
I should know this, but I don't, what were, is this a liberal on liberal kind of thing?
Oh, yeah, he was very much a leftist. So in the 1930s, so he never joined the Communist Party.
Like
But
the
he often
USA?
sounds a lot like he was communist. In his poetry and some of his writings in the 30s, especially, he's very leftist. You know, it ebbs and flows throughout his life with changing political times. He retreats from his leftism when he's, you know, when he's destitute in the early 40s because he's being called communist and atheist and he's being picketed. He retreats publicly, at least, from his outspoken leftism. Again, in the early 1950s, he was brought before McCarthy and the Un-American Committee. And he, again, like felt like he needed to be really careful. But he was very leftist and liberal in general.
So there's like one thing that's really striking is the disconnect between like the avowed values of nice white people and their behavior. And like my big question was like, does Hughes have a specific hypothesis for why that is? And then I wanted to propose a particularly insidious explanation and see if you think it coheres with what he says. And the insidious explanation is, it seems like in a lot of these cases, maybe not explicitly, but implicitly, you know, there's like a baseline for how good one's life should go. And the nice white people just set it lower for the Black people in their lives. And they expect the Black people to be really grateful when they sort of get a little bit above, you know, so like this comes up with the Pembertons expect Arnie to be grateful for this life he's living. And it's crazy that he would also want like a rich social life, you know, in addition to that. And, you know, Godmother thinks he should be grateful for the stipend, and it's ridiculous when he demands creative freedom instead of that. And Simple should be grateful to his boss that he's employed, and when he demands equal pay or to be promoted at the rate a white person was, that's just like asking too much. So I wondered what he would think of that insidious explanation, or if he just had a general kind of explanation for the disconnect.
that sounds like something that Hughes would think is very plausible in a lot of cases. I think that Hughes, as far as I can tell, his work on this issue resists a sort of generalized account or explanation of why these things happen. And I think that's in part because, again, like his views are very complex. Like in some cases, when he talks about nice white people, what he still really seems to mean is these people aren't nice at all. They think they're nice, but they're really assholes. The niceness is illusory. Other times, though, he writes about white niceness and sincerely endorses the claim that the white people in question are being nice, but he thinks that the niceness has these sort of negative downstream effects. And again, he has a really rich portrayal of like different white people with different psychologies. And so I think that it kind of varies a lot from case to case in his work. That's one reason why I didn't want to define nice white people, because it changes so much, not only in Hughes, but the history of Black literature on the topic as well.
Well, so we've got two hands in the chat online, so I'm gonna call on the first hand, which is Graham Hayes.
Hey, oh Lord, everything's broken.
Stop talking. There you go.
All right, is it good now? Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, sorry, Jessica and I are watching together, so sound reverberation and all that. What was it?
Can you hear them?
I cannot.
Yeah, you need to turn your sound up. You turned it down
Yeah. So
on your laptop.
yeah.
It's okay, I muted us, just if that was the problem.
This is why you calling me first and not Bruce. So I was just curious. So I know bouncing off of Mark at the beginning, he was talking a little bit, asked you to talk a little bit more about the epistemology of ignorance that you were referencing earlier. And I know you said that that title was a bit misleading because you wanted to focus more on just some excerpts and analysis. I was curious though, for this project, at least right now, I feel like it's framed around epistemology. And I was curious if you were interested in maybe expanding the framing a little bit, because a lot of what I found very impactful wasn't merely the ignorance that white people in his experience would display, but also their like reactive attitudes as like a result of their ignorance or being called out. And despite Bruce's best efforts, I'm no epistemologist, so maybe this is all kind of tied together, but I almost felt like, there's this sort of like white ignorance on one end, but there's almost this sort of like rage and indignation on the other end. And so I was curious, like, if that at all was, if you kind of tie all that together, or if you kind of view this as like a multifaceted project where like epistemology of like ignorance is like one facet of it, but then you have like these other facets as well that could include like a study of reactive attitudes or something like that.
Are we still muted or can I?
You can talk, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Graham. Yeah, so a couple ways to answer that question. One is that I think this project is bigger than it's bigger than just maybe the tie to epistemology of ignorance. That was a very early title that I gave the Humanities Center when I wasn't quite sure what direction I wanted to go. And I do think that's an important direction that I will go. But I also think there's lots of issues. There's so many things today I had to cut, and it was already a small subset of things I wanted to talk about in Hughes related to some of these readings and others. So yeah, I'm certainly open to the project expanding a little bit. In terms of the sort of emotional component that you're talking about, I think I would want to resist pulling that apart so much from the ignorance. So I find very attractive, like Black feminist approaches to epistemology say that try to break the sharp distinction between like reason and emotion, or knowledge on the one hand and affect on the other. Like I see them as very much sort of closely tied together with one another. So I think that, and I think that's true even in Mills. So I think or certainly in a lot of work on this topic that appeals to Mill's work. So I think, yeah, I'm quite comfortable with there being a lot of emotional affective stuff, even in a discussion of ignorance and epistemology.
Okay, it looks like Bruce is up next.
So I'm gonna just say, in keeping, this isn't really my question, Josh, but I think epistemologists have ignored this kind of knowing what it's like that people talk about in terms sometimes of knowing what it's like to experience red. But I think they've actually ignored that kind of evidence and talked about knowing how and knowing that and evidence in those contexts. But I think that's actually a worthwhile path of investigation. My question is about the point of your talk. I'm not quite sure what it is, and here's why I think. So there are examples you give from Pemberton's and Godmother about how they treated those people, and I think it doesn't have anything to do per se with racism. It's just an example. But if you treated your own white biological child that way, we'd say that was a bad way to treat your child. So it's just a general kind of way that you shouldn't be treating people in that manner. The other cases, there are cases of racism involving simple examples, you know, have been discussed a little in Q&A, and they're about racism, I think. And all of those cases so far, I'd say, those aren't examples of nice people. Those are not nice people. You want to use nice people as you did so that they are, oh, go ahead. But then I'll say, well, what about really nice people? I think I'm a really nice person. Or anyway, you should aspire to being a really nice person. So then I don't get the point. It seems like attacking a straw man if you define nice people so they qualify and then criticize them rightly in the way that you do. The other point I wonder is, I wonder whether your point of your talk was just an exhortation that people who are not really getting out there and doing things and just talking about it and then showing their true racism in certain contexts, you guys should be getting out there and doing something about it. Your talk is then just an exhortation. I thought there was a philosophical point to be explored at the end. It was about responsibility. I think that's a really, really hard question about how responsible and in what ways are you responsible if you're, I don't know, a really nice white person in terms of, you know, all kinds of injustices. I don't know the answer. I think it's a really hard question. It's the bottom of issues about reparations and the like. So my, in summary, is I think those first examples are just examples of not really nice people. You might be making just an exhortation. You're not making a intellectual point. You just want people to get out there and do something. Or there's some really, really important philosophical issues that you just introduced, but didn't really pursue about how responsible are what I call really nice white people for, I don't know, doing whatever, something.
So the point of the talk was not an exhortation. It was just, I wanted to identify features of a Hughesian account of nice white people. And I mean, you are saying that you don't see racism in some of the stories. That's fine. I'm interested in the fact that Hughes does. He perceives it that way. He experienced some of these things himself. He perceived them that way. He's the author of the text and perceived them that way. So that's what I'm interested in. And I mean, yes, as I mentioned, yeah, so in some cases, I think the white people might just not be nice after all. Again, I don't think Hughes thinks that's true of a lot of them. I think he thinks they are genuinely nice and that sometimes niceness is the problem. Other times he would just probably say, yeah, they turned out not to be very nice at all. But what a lot of the nice white people have in common is perceiving themselves as nice and liberal and progressive, whether or not they are. And what Hughes' account, and so what I didn't talk about is why I focused on Langston Hughes specifically. And one reason why that question arises is because, again, there's over 200 years of Black literature that deal exactly with this problem, that talks about the problem of supposedly liberal, progressive white people who understand themselves that way, who nonetheless, despite that self-conception, contribute to racist harm. And there's lots of different perspectives, but what we find is that Hughes writes on this topic in as much depth as anybody. I mean, there's other people who write about it a lot in depth, like James Baldwin too, but Hughes really explores it. It's one of the central themes of a lot of his work. And his work, I don't want to call it representative, but a lot of the features that he draws attention to and highlights and dramatizes in his work are features that we find throughout the last 200 years of Black literature and Black thought, commonly sort of thematically recurring. And so that's what I'm interested in. So whether or not we think the concept of white niceness is useful or not, Hughes and lots of other Black authors over the last 200 years have felt that it's important to draw attention to specific ways that white liberals and progressive cause these harms. And so I'm interested in what they have to say about that.
Yeah, Josh, I just want to say that if you're talking about it, of course, all that's good historically, but we would all condemn those things as being inappropriate reactions that you cite. And so then he wonders, or some people wonder, why people that I call really nice white people are indignant when people accuse them of being racist.
I don't think it's true that we would all, I think, again, there's always an over there-ness of racism. And I think everybody, myself included, has a tendency to be racist, contribute to racist harms, and at least have the potential to. And it's often the case that the people in this room are candidates for exactly the sort of person who could cause harm despite not knowing that we do. So I don't think that, and at any rate, we're not well positioned epistemically to know whether we're doing the harm or not. Yeah, Jada.
I just wanted to, I had a question that was somewhat similar to Graham's, but more trying to connect the epistemic injustice to the stuff on blame. So it's interesting, there was quite a bit on blame, like Langston Hughes
I thought of
blaming.
you when I got to
Did
this.
you? Oh, yes. Langston Hughes blaming white people everywhere for what happened in Alabama. But then there was also what stood out most to me was all of the white people blaming back when things were, when things were pointed out to them. And so one thought that I sort of had about this kind of connection between epistemic injustice and blame is the ways in which white people feel wronged when their ignorance is pointed out to them. I think because of their conception of themselves as nice and liberal and things like that. I think you were right to say in response to Bruce, that's kind of how I was conceptualizing nice white people, is people who conceive of themselves or other people conceive of them as nice, whether they're actually nice or not is a further question. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, but either way, there is something about everybody here that's not nice, because as soon as their ignorance is pointed out to them, they feel wrong rather than being open to the idea that they're not. And so they react with reactive attitudes. They're the ones who are actually wrong, rather than, being able to accept that, they're ignorant about something and therefore causing harm.
Yeah, I think like if we go to the Austin Channing Brown quote, she said most white people are more concerned about being called racist than about whether their actions are in fact racist. So I think, yeah, if you're being told by a Black person or by Austin Channing Brown that something you're doing is racist and your first instinct is defense, then you are the right kind, that you're exactly the kind of nice white person that she is talking about.
Right, good. So I just thought there was this connection between feeling wrong and reacting with reactive attitude and having that epistemic injustice. That's why you feel wrong, because you can't recognize your epistemic ignorance.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
I see there's a hand in the chat from Dr. Orletta Caldwell, who's been waiting a while, and then maybe we can go to Brian. Is that a hand or?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and then we'll go to Brian.
Hi, thank you. I won't take a long time. I don't know if I have a question, it's a statement. I really enjoyed the talk. Because as an African American, and the dissertation, I was studying this, and I use racial frame. I can't even think of the thing right now. I'm so full right now. But it was saying that even the way our society is set up, racial white framework, even though most liberal whites, even if they're anti-racist, our society is so ingrained with white superiority that even if you're against it, subconsciously you hold on to those truths. And what I have found in life, I'm a middle-aged African-American woman, is most white people don't like feeling uncomfortable. And so no matter how you're feeling, it's damaging because, like you said, you don't want to feel that way. And so when it's reflected on you, you get upset. So what happens with most African Americans, and I don't want to speak for a whole race, it's usually more damaging to deal with a progressive white than I have with MAGA white. I know how MAGA white, and it's bullied in ignorance, but it's harder for progressive white people because truthfully, as a culture, I just find that you don't like to be uncomfortable. And you can't change anything unless there's discomfort. And so that's the big thing I always found. And that's why I really resonated with Langston Hughes and what he went through. And we do know when he's saying nice white folks, I feel like how we feel, we know that not everybody is evil and hate us and think we're subordinate. It's just a reflection of society and this lack of just, wanting to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I mean, I think that fits well, like thematically with a lot of, again, like a theme in that I've seen in a lot of Black literature and current literature is that not just that nice white people can be harmful, but that we are often the ones who are the most harmful. Both because of the intensity of our reactions, because of how much it challenges our self-identification, and also some authors have pointed out, like Ijeoma Oluo, that it's also about proximity. Liberal, progressive white people are much more likely to be in daily contact with Black people than the Ku Klux Klan or alt-right extremists. So it's just a fact, like socially and about our psychologies, that we can be especially harmful. So yeah, thank you for making that point.
I think Brian was waiting, and then I see Hayan has got a question online. So we'll go to Brian first, though.
All right.
I think this is a question about like interpretive methodology, but I'll like make my way around to it. So there's a distinction between criticizing naive and overly laudatory attitudes toward incrementalism or something like progressivist incrementalism versus being an outright skeptic about the phenomenon of incrementalist progressivism, like there have actually been incremental gains in racial justice or something like that. And both of those views seemed to me to come out in the simple vignettes. Mm-hmm. And then I was thinking, well, I mean, as a literary conceit, simple is very unsimple, right? So it doesn't seem to be that he's a vehicle for, I don't know, you can tell me, but it doesn't seem like it's a vehicle for Hughes to like proclaim his sort of like full-throated views about things. It's more like here's what a sort of no-nonsense, untutored mind or something would say about the situation, and here's me sort of winking at that as containing a kernel of truth because I'm a sophisticate. I'm an urban literary member of the intelligentsia and so on. But there's something to it, and how much of this I buy into, I'll leave that to you, the reader, to discern and so on. So the interpretive question is like, how does one reconstruct something like a philosophical view from simple? Yeah, and those stories and like attribute that to Hughes? That's not really a challenge. I was just wondering, like, how do you go about it?
I'm glad you asked, because this is it's always complicated tracing fictional characters' views back to the author. As someone who studies Plato, that's like a problem that like has dogged scholarship basically since Plato lived. Hughes, though, there's several reasons why for thinking that Hughes actually means a lot of what simple says, a lot of what he puts into his mouth. One is that the views that we see in Simple's mouth appear so much throughout so much of Hughes's work, in his poetry, even in his children's stories. We can see glimpses of these views. his autobiography. So we have a lot of, I mean, there's like 15,000 pages worth of Hughes literature that we have, and there's a lot there. And so you can sort of pull out things that recur. The other is, he's wonderfully explicit about this. I wish Plato had done this. He says, oh, I can't find the thing, but I had a quotation. It might be the next slide. If it's not, then we will just forget about it. Yes, the character of my simple-minded friend is really very simple. It is just myself talking to me, or else me talking to myself. I have developed this inner discussion into two characters, the this being me and the that being simple, or vice versa.
Sorry, I'm trying to, I know there's been some
Well,
problems.
that's fine.
It's in the chat, anyway.
So, you know, he characterizes it this way. And then a third reason that we have is that some of the simple stories are actually originated as columns that Hughes wrote in his own voice. And then he just kind of adds in, turns it into a conversation that he puts into Simple's mouth. So that's not true of all of them, certainly. And we should rightly be skeptical about. I mean, it's not a one-to-one correspondence of like Simple's claims to Hughes.
I mean, doesn't that quote imply that Simple's interlocutor is a facet of Hughes's personality?
Yes.
And the interlocutor is sort of sober. and
Yes, that is
not
true.
Entirely, it doesn't buy in all the way to Simple's view.
Yeah, that is true. But interestingly, he never turns his own essays into the interlocutor's views. It's always turned into Simple's views. And again, a lot of what he says in Simple, even if it's not just taken, like plagiarized basically from his own essays, there's also often his views appear in a more scholarly way in other essays. So I do think, and it would vary from view to view, but I think there is a lot that we should take seriously about Simple as representative of, you know, Hughes' views. The caveat, I mean, one caveat is that Hughes' views changed throughout his life. Not surprisingly, he lived through a very tumultuous period of time, and his views of nice white people and world affairs changed a lot. Some periods in his life, he was very vitriolic toward nice white people. Other times he was very sort of patient and indulgent, and sometimes that reflected political realities of the times. So I think has to be a lot of nuance in interpreting Simple on a case-by-case basis, based on whatever the view is and what are the resources we have for putting it into context.
Clayton is waiting.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for the nice talk, Josh. Yeah, I don't know how popular the concept of epistemology of ignorance is in the discipline of philosophy, but I think it's very interesting. Usually we talk about how we gain knowledge, but it's also very interesting for us to learn how we gain ignorance. So that said, I was thinking, is there one universal epistemology of ignorance? So for example, your study is based on the racism against Black people, but there are Asians, there are Latinos, and we are prejudiced against. I don't know whether for the same reason or just people have to find different defects in other groups. Therefore, so individualized reasoning for prejudice, being lazy or being calculating, whatever. So I don't know. So I think maybe my question is, epistemology of ignorance, is it a universal thing, or do you think there's a lot of different varieties of the epistemology?
Yeah, thank you. So it is, as a concept, one of the ways it's been influential is that it's spawned off into a lot of other people drawing on the concept, expanding on it. And yes, lots of people do write about other, so to speak, epistemologies of ignorance. Like there's an article titled 3 Epistemologies of Ignorance that like sort of talks about different versions of it. And so, yeah, it does. I think it varies based on what kind of topic is being addressed by a particular philosophical or non-philosophical, for that matter, writer. Also what culture is being addressed. You know, Mills is especially talking about US culture, but people writing elsewhere have written about epistemologies of ignorance in their culture. So yeah, I think it's one of the nice things about it is that it's a flexible and elastic concept that can serve a lot of uses.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions for our speaker?
You talked about how nice white people are connected with progressivism. And I can see how that makes sense from a historical context where they're on the right side of history with abolitionism and anti-segregationism.
Mhm.
Today, it strikes me that a lot of people we would consider conservative probably don't think of themselves as racist. They probably think
Yeah.
being not in favor of BLM and being against affirmative action makes them nice white people. They actually have Black people's interests at heart. So are we thinking that progressivism today is connected, is correct? And are the nice white people we're looking for because it's connected to this lineage of being on the right side of history? Or is it because progressives today are voting en masse with African-American voters? Or is there another possibility?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that's a really great point, and also reflective of why I didn't want to like give a definition or like necessary and sufficient conditions. So I think it's true that like even like right-wing people often could potentially illustrate a lot of sort of the characteristic signs of nice white people. I think when we look at like Hughes' perspective or other contemporary perspectives on this, it varies a lot by perception. A lot of the niceness is about perceived niceness. And in the first instance, that does mean self-perceived, but it also means how others perceive them. So, it's about Hughes, there might have been segregationists and white citizens council folks in his time who thought of themselves as nice to Black people. And that's fine. But from Hughes' perspective, they sort of are marked by their politics as being white people to stay away from, so to speak, or that like engage in harmful behavior in a way that sort of clearly demarcates them. Whereas Hughes struggles more with the white liberals in his circle or that he encounters, because it's harder to figure out who's going to turn out to be harmful and who's not. And so I think a lot of it is, it's a very sort of non-static, dynamic kind of niceness that depends a lot on who's doing the perceiving, how they perceive, how the person perceives themselves. I also think there's an issue of like, not just do you think of yourself as a nice person, white person, but like, would you say racial justice is one of your political priorities? Most liberals and progressives would answer yes to that. A lot of people on the right or Trump supporters would be less inclined to like identify that as one of their main values. So yeah, it's complicated and shifting, but I think you're exactly right to ask that question. It's a great question.
Any further questions? Well, then I'd like us to thank our speakers.
Yeah, I was just so excited to talk about Langston Hughes today. I have so much to say.
It is a lot.